Okay, so what we've gone over so far has been um, some of the start of the Cold War, which names uh, World War II is over, but it doesn't mean that conflict is done. And it's Harry Truman that really is at the center of this thing. Remember, FDR dies in, it's in May of 1945. The war's still going on. So Truman has to end the war in Europe and then has to end the war in the Pacific. And well, let's just get into it. This is his approval rating chart. Notice when he first gets in, there's a tremendous amount of support for him, especially as the war is ending. And then, like, it falls down real quick to some of the lowest levels that American presidents have ever had. And then it goes back up again, and then it goes down again, then up, and then a steady decline down. And a lot of this has to do with the Korean War over here. So that's Harry Truman. He's an up and down president. Um, Historians said during the time there was a lot of his presidency. He was not very popular, but historians have looked back on him and said this is one of the most influential presidencies as far as foreign affairs go that we've ever had. So to start off, before we get to the end of the or the beginning of the Cold War, let's talk about the atomic bomb being dropped. Hiroshima was the first atomic bomb being dropped. The bomb was nicknamed Little Boy. August 6, 1945. The pilot of the plane was named Paul Tibbets. And of course, like I said maybe the week before, 120,000 people dead just like that, like in that space of a heartbeat, not to mention all the people who died later from radiation poisoning and those kind of things. And somebody asked him 50 years later, on the 50th anniversary of this, do you regret, Paul, that you did this, that you were the one who, pushed the button, all the people died? And he said, no, he didn't regret it, and he'd do it again because he believed that he was saving lives. He named the plane after his mother. His mother's name was Enola Gay Tibbets, and so the plane that dropped the bomb was the Enola Gay. And of course, the Japanese did not surrender yet. And so the atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. Do you remember the nickname of the plane? Batman, because it looked like a big tennis ball or a big soccer ball, just a big fat thing. August 9th. And then violated Japan service. And this is under Harry Truman. Harry Truman didn't know about the Manhattan Project. He didn't know about all of this stuff. While he was vice president, he learns of it like as soon as he gets in the office. So he does the best he can, I think, with what he's got. Now, according to the content statements, this is how they phrase it. And so this is how I'm going to teach it to you. You reach superpower status when you have nuclear weapons. Not only is your economy huge and your military huge, but you also have global power, but you also, to obtain superpower status, you have to have atomic bombs too, according to the content statements. We can disagree with that and debate that all, but how they view it is that. So for a time, we were the only atomic superpower in the world. And just some pictures of Hiroshima. They chose Hiroshima because it was kind of like in this valley, and so when the bomb was dropped, the destructive forces would kind of bounce back and forth off the different sides. You can see the radiation scars from people who lived on the outskirts of that, and so that was something that people had to live with for a long time. This was supposed to be the Enola Gay back here, but I didn't do my animations right, so sorry about that. Now, there seemed to be a sense of international cooperation for a minute. Because there were several things that happened that we did together, even with the Soviet Union. And remember, the Soviet Union was our ally. We have not always been enemies with Russia. And so we established the United Nations in 1945. FDR had started it, and it gets completed during the Truman years. The UN is broken up into two things. There's the General Assembly, which is basically like a world parliament, where every single country gets to send an ambassador to the UN, and then we have every single country around the world has a voice, and they can propose resolutions and all that kind of stuff. But then there's the Security Council, and this is where things get a little bit problematic. The Security Council has 5 permanent members. It has 6 other members that are elected by the General Assembly on a 2-year basis, but it has 5 permanent members. These were the 5 major countries on the side of the Allies at the end of the war. So you have Great Britain, Soviet Union, France, China, United States. These 5 are really the main power players in the United Nations. I'll explain why in just a second, but do you remember why the United States did not join the League of Nations? Remember this in World War I? Woodrow Wilson wants to have an international peacekeeping organization. It's the 14th point of the 14 points. And the Allies in Europe say okay, and they join the League of Nations. Even Japan joins the League of Nations. But the United States doesn't, right? Why? What was the reasoning? Do you remember? We shouldn't have to give up our right to declare war, trade agreements, those kind of things. Somebody else should not be able to tell us where to send our troops or who to trade with and who not to, right? That was the big problem. So here, they fixed that. Fixed it. These 5 members of the Security Council, Great Britain, Soviet Union, France, China, United States, they all have a veto. If 190 countries around the world say we want to put sanctions on Russia in the UN, what can Russia do? They can veto it. One person, one group can say no. Now that was good for us because we didn't want to have to send our troops anywhere that they told us to. So this is our way of getting around that. But you can see that there's problems. What if China invades Taiwan and the UN wants to do something about it? China can just veto it. And Russia can veto it. Right? That's the thing we put in there. And that's really kind of what I'm talking about here. Veto power. Remember the fear of the League of Nations. But my point is that Stalin and FDR and Churchill and others, Chiang Kai-shek of China, Charles de Gaulle of France, they got together and this is cooperation. We're going to form this thing and it's actually going to have power and actually it's going to work instead of the League of Nations, which was really weak. Another thing that's the UN building. Now, does anybody know what city it's located in? I mean, it's the center for the global government. So where would you? Well, you have the right country. If you're going to pick one city in the most powerful country in the world, and it's not our nation's capital, because we can't have the UN capital and the nation's capital. New York City. Another thing that the Allies did together was establish the nation of Israel in 1947. Sorry, I don't want people from hearing that cough. It was a homeland for the Jewish refugees in Israel. Now, you might remember that there was a Holocaust. We haven't really gone over much of it yet. I do plan on showing you at least one thing about it after the end of course exam. But from what I've been told, you've done Holocaust stuff with almost all of your school, or even in elementary school. basically it's a place for the survivors of the Holocaust to go and have somewhere that's supposed to be their own, where they're not going to be persecuted by other people. Now, immediately, so this is the cooperation of the United Nations getting together in those years after the war was over. We should know that immediately they were attacked by their Palestinian and other Arab neighbors. Does anybody know why? Why did they not want a Jewish homeland right in the middle of the Middle East? Short version, you know? It's a religious tension, right? This is Arab Palestinian land. They said it's not Jewish land. It belongs to people who are Arab by background, Muslim by background, and you're giving it to Europeans who are not our religion. So they were almost immediately attacked, but Israel somehow beats them back. I mean, they don't even have a real military yet, but they somehow beat them back. And just in case we follow this kind of stuff, every single evangelical in the world, in the United States at this point, evangelical Christian looks at this and they're like, oh, this is prophecy being fulfilled because God promised that they'd have their own homeland again at the end of days. So lots of people started predicting the end of the world. But anyway, you can see that there were many Jewish settlements in this area that we call, this is the Mediterranean Sea. Here's Israel. You can see there's many Jewish settlements. And then when it was created, the state of Israel, you can see there was this orange land given to the Jews, and this yellow was given to the Muslim Arabs, and it's really been problems ever since. That's their flag. Now, anybody know what this is? Star of David, David being the king of Israel. What did Hitler use? How did he use that symbol? You know? Him? David? Right on their arms. Star of David. So you can tell from the distance who is a Jew and who's not. So I don't know how you could go your way to avoid them. I don't know. Another way we cooperated in the wars after that was the Nuremberg trials, putting the Nazis on trial in their own homeland in a town called Nuremberg in Germany. Many of these Nazi leaders were sentenced to death. Many of them committed suicide instead of, actually facing justice. Those who were not captured and put on trial, a lot of them actually fled to Argentina. And so if you go to Argentina today, there will be a lot of people in the land where there is dark hair, dark complected skin, dark eyes. You'll have a lot of people who look like Guy. Blonde hair, blue eyes, light color skin, pale. And a lot of them are that's because they fled to South America. Here is Hermann Göring. He was Hitler's right-hand man. He is on trial. He was sentenced to death. He committed suicide in his jail cell before he faced the music. So again, the point is that the major powers of the world seem to be cooperating. Here's something else they cooperate with. And this kind of played to Stalin's fears. Stalin was scared. Well, World War I, Germany attacked Russia. World War II, Germany attacked Russia. That seems to be a pattern, doesn't it? Stalin doesn't want that to happen again. And so the Allies agree to break up Germany into 4 different parts, 4 temporary occupation zones. I'll show you a picture in just a second. West Germany was occupied by democratic countries, France, Britain, and the US. East Germany was occupied by communists, Soviets. You want to guess? West Germany, when it became its own country, was it democratic or communist? Democratic, right? And East Germany, when it became its own country, was it democratic or communist? communist. It just makes sense. And then they took the city of Berlin, which is inside East Germany, the capital of Germany, and they divided it along the same lines. The west of Berlin was democratic, was controlled by democratic countries, and the east was controlled by communist Soviet Union. So, everybody good with that? Okay, so let me show you the picture then. See what happened here is these three, France, Britain, United States, these three joined eventually and just became one country, West Germany. And these occupiers left and they became their own country. And they became very democratic. When I was growing up to age 11, 10 or 11, that's West Germany, right? That's just how I grew up doing it. And this over here was East Germany. And East Germany was communist, and West Germany was democratic, and that's the way it was. In Berlin, right here, the western part was democratic, and the eastern part was communist, and that's just the way it was, right? And it went right down the middle of Berlin, a big wall to separate. Basically because the communists didn't want people to keep going to the Democrat side. Okay, so that's the height of the cooperation. Forming the State of Israel, forming the United Nations, putting the Nazis on trial, dividing up Germany. Now, we're going to get to the tension between them. The Cold War was the unofficial war between the Soviet Union and the United States. Unofficial meaning we never fought face to face. Anytime we ever fought, it was through proxies, which means we would support the South Vietnamese and they would support the North Vietnamese, but we would never meet on the battlefield and fight directly. But we came close. Never any direct confrontations, no actual war. That's why it's called a Cold War. It's not like there's a shooting war. It's not in the middle of a hot battle. But the relationship between them from 45 to 91 was extremely tense. Literally, there could have been a nuclear war at any moment. And your grandparents, my parents, grew up in an atmosphere where they were like, what's that thing in the sky? Is it a Soviet satellite that's trying to find out where to drop an atomic bomb? Right? They did duck and cover drills, etc. Duck and cover means, you know how we do fire drills and we do tornado drills? Well, in addition to that, they had nuclear holocaust drills, where in case a nuclear bomb was dropping near you, you would get under your table and hide. As if that was going to save you. It wasn't funny, but that's what they grew up with. That's the kind of fear. And just ask your grandparents about it, see what they tell you. Even your parents, some of them are my age, a little bit older. They can tell you too that we were kind of worried in the 80s. You don't know what's going to happen. This is an arm wrestling match. You can see here John F. Kennedy, President of the United States, Nikita Khrushchev, Premier of Russia, setting on hydrogen bombs, having an arm wrestling match. This is more about the Cuban Missile Crisis, which we'll get to later. But that kind of like every president was doing that arm wrestling kind of with the Soviet Union for prestige and control of the world. You've heard about this already when Churchill came to Missouri. He said that an iron curtain has fallen over Europe, and on one side are the free nations, and on the other sides are the people oppressed by communism. I'll let you write that down, then I want to show you a map. And really, this white line right here represents the Iron Curtain. Now, does anybody know why it was called the Soviet bloc? or the Eastern Bloc. That means these countries right here were very much influenced by the Soviet Union. They were not necessarily a part of the Soviet Union, but they were heavily influenced by them. Now, historically speaking, why does the line stop here? What had happened to make it so that the Soviet Union influenced these countries up to here? During World War II. This is when Stalin was trying to retake German captured areas. He got about this far, and afterwards he said, well, you know what? I'm going to keep it. Or at least heavily influence it so that there's any buffer zones between me and Germany so that I don't get attacked again. And of course, on this side of the line are all of the, today we would call these NATO countries. That's what we would call them today, mostly. But they are the free peoples of Europe. And again, remember, Truman's approval rating. Okay, so then let's talk about containment. This is a term that's very key. Even if it's not only in the course exam, it's very key for you to understand this phrase, this word containment. The first time you get this idea was in what was called the Long Telegram, written by George Kennan, a State Department official. Now, why was it called the Long Telegram? Because it was over 1,000 pages long. Can you imagine typing 1,000 pages? I mean, it would suck, right? But you can imagine somebody typing about that much. Like, imagine, do you know how telegrams work? Dot, dot, dash, 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 dot. Like, you have to do that for 1,000 pages. Can you imagine doing that for 1,000 pages? That's a long telegram. That's why they call it the Long Telegram. But what did the Long Telegram say? It basically said that the policy of the Truman administration should be to contain communism, to quarantine it. Our goal is not to let it spread. Our goal is not to go in and destroy communism, because let's be honest, the Soviet Union has too much power. Our goal is wherever it's at, keep it there, keep it contained. Don't allow it to spread beyond its present borders. Where that Iron Curtain is, keep it there. Notice we're not going to try to save the peoples of Poland. We're just going to try to make sure it doesn't get into West Germany and Austria and all that. Now, so this picture kind of shows you the difference between what we wanted to do and what they wanted to do. The Soviet Union wanted to spread their influence all over the third world, all over the more primitive countries of the world, like Iran to get oil, like Africa to get resources, like these other places over here, basically for power, prestige, and resources. And of course, the United States wants to keep the Soviet Union out of all of those places. So Truman is president, and whereas FDR and Stalin seemed to get along, I would not call them friends. They were definitely not buddies. They only met face to face like twice, but they seemed to have a better relationship. FDR kind of sweet talked Stalin because he knew he needed him. Whereas President Truman, when he gets in office, he distrusts Stalin and basically hates him with a passion. Did not want to negotiate with him, right? So that's the kind of setup that's happened for a couple of years. And then in 1947, he basically outlines, here's what my policy is going to be, especially when facing communists. There was this Greek civil war, a civil war in Greece. Britain was announcing that it was leaving. It's not going to help keep the peace, it's out. And so Truman asked Congress for $400 million of aid to send to Greece and Turkey. This is not Lend-Lease. This is not World War II. But what he's saying is, what we did in World War II, what we did in World War I, giving supplies and stuff, we're going to keep doing that for the duration. Right? We're going to keep helping these countries far and abroad And they are resisting communism, and we're going to help them. The Truman Doctrine, he said, I believe it must be the foreign policy of the United States to support the free people who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressure. In other words, to resist communism from spreading. If you are fighting in Greece and Turkey to overthrow communists and get them out of your country, then we will help you out. We may not send troops, but we will help you. We'll send military aid, tanks and bombs, and we'll send you money. And it worked. The communists did not win in Greece and Turkey. So in short, the Truman Doctrine is sending money and military aid to any resistance, any nations resisting communist takeover, short of involvement of U.S. troops. This should sound familiar because this is pretty much what we do today. This is what we're doing in the Ukraine today, for example. There's not communism there. We're trying to keep them from being taken over by horrible dictators, short of getting our troops involved. So when President Biden is doing what he's doing, he's echoing Harry Truman. Additionally, we upped the ante a little bit. It wasn't just Greece, it was all of Europe. There are some countries that seem to be teetering towards falling towards communism. Italy, even the major power of France, where they had been divided between a Nazi puppet government and just being ruled by the Nazis, and so that was kind of difficult to get them back on track. And so, not to mention that Europe is devastated, and they don't have the money to rebuild. So the Marshall Plan, George Marshall was the Army Chief of Staff. He is the one who led women into the military. He is now the Secretary of State, and he says, under Truman, and he says, we're going to send money and we're going to help them out. And here's the cool thing. If we give them money, they will be indebted to us, and they'll look favorably on us. And they won't join the Soviet Union, they'll stay with us, because we gave them money. It pumped $12 billion into the European economies, and it staved off West Germany going communist, France going communist, Italy going communist, and it helped rebuild a ton of places that wouldn't have been able to be rebuilt for decades otherwise. You can see the amount of money we're giving each place. Now we give the United Kingdom a ton of money because they're one of our biggest allies, and they had a lot of destruction. But you can see there was no money given on this side of that Iron Curtain, on the eastern side of the Iron Curtain. It was all to these places to keep them from going communist. This is an organization that you've probably heard a lot lately. NATO, it stands for North Atlantic Treaty Organization. In 1947, seeing that communism is a threat, seeing that Joseph Stalin isn't the great guy maybe that some people thought he was. I'm not sure anybody ever thought he was a good guy, but at least he's not our ally anymore. NATO joins, there's four. It's North America, United States and Canada, and the Western European countries. And basically the idea is an attack on one is an attack on all of us. If the Soviet Union attacked East Germany, then everybody that's in NATO is going to go help fight the Soviet Union. So you can see at first these countries in yellow were part of NATO, plus the United States and Canada on the other side of the Atlantic. And more have joined since. Today Poland is a part of the NATO. These countries right here, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, are part of it. So almost certainly Vladimir Putin will invade them, right?
Maybe.
Probably. A big blow came to containment and to Truman's popularity in 1949 when China fell to communism. American-aided Chiang Kai-shek, the president of China, was overthrown by Mao Zedong, the communist dictator. Now, this is a big deal because, like that, 800 million people, the biggest country in the world at the time, goes communist. And that means that Truman is not containing communism, right? And here's the thing, though. A State Department official named Dean Acheson wrote what was called the White Paper, and in the White Paper he said we should give up the Chinese to the communists because it's not worth fighting. And this starts the stereotype that Democrats are soft on communism because they gave up an entire country, China, to communism without putting up a fight. When Truman's stated goal is to contain communism and he can't do it, then Truman must be a bad president. That's why you've got this up and down with Truman. Was containment working? And there is Mao Zedong, one of his propaganda posters. He actually lies, his body lies in the Forbidden City in Beijing right now. And it's almost like it's a shrine to a dead god. A dead god that killed somewhere between 40 to 70 million people, either directly or through terrible policies. I mean, he killed more people than Hitler and Stalin combined. And he's still held up in Chinese propaganda as a hero. In that same year, the Soviets successfully tested their first atomic bomb. And now we have two superpowers, atomic superpowers anyway. This is a big setback for Truman. You can see why in 1949 his popularity goes way down. The world is definitely a more dangerous place because now it's a nuclear game of cat and mouse. In essence, the atomic bomb now becomes a political device. They invade us, or we will threaten to use the atomic bomb to kill you. So you can say here, in 1949, it had gone up after he had been reelected to presidency, and then steady decline down. Now, what helps it go back up? Right before that is what was called the Berlin Airlift. Stalin decided to blockade Western Berlin after West Germany was reunified. Remember, West Germany had the United States, Britain, France, three different parts. Well, they decided to reunify into one country, West Germany. And when they decided to do that, Stalin was like, no, that's not what I want. I don't want any part of Germany reunified. And so he took West Berlin, something he could control, and he blockaded it. He basically said, these people aren't going to get any food in or out. The people going in or out. And so here's what Truman could have done. He could have done nothing, which means that he leaves West Berlin to fall to communism, which goes against the containment theory. He could drop the A-bombs on Russia, because they don't have them yet. But why start World War III 3 years after World War II? Or he can go down the middle of the road, and that's what Truman chose to do here. He chose the middle of the road. He chose instead to airlift millions of tons of food supplies to the West Berliners for weeks. And you can see there how many flights it took. How many flights were a part of this. Now, if Stalin had shot down one of those planes or one of those helicopters, it would have been over. There would have been war. But he didn't. Basically, Truman was daring him to do it. And eventually Stalin backed down. And Truman won. So you can actually see that his popularity goes up. But then, of course, China goes communist and they sort of get their big bombers, so it goes back down again. Here's a picture. This is an American plane, landing and dropping food, and the little kids are realizing that, hey, this is why we need to eat today. Because Stalin has this blockade. Yeah.
Another thing they would gather when the double base is for the destination of the United States.
there's a guy who just gave little treats to the kids. I can't remember what his nickname was. Like Candyman or something like
I
that.
think it was, I don't know.
Cool little stories like that. They just, I don't know. I really like them. Now, we don't have time to start the Cold War, the Korean War. So let's start that tomorrow. But if you had any grandparents or great grandparents that fought in the Korean War, let me know. It's a forgotten war. Keep those for tomorrow, please.